So I finally got my hands on the Canon RF 24mm 1.8 lens. I'm going to be using it for portraits and video on the R5, the R7 and the C70. Let's get started. Starting off in this greenhouse, I wanted to just use the 24mm lens throughout the whole shoot. And it took me a little while to get used to, as I wouldn't normally just pack a 24mm prime for the kind of portraits I usually shoot. But we made it work. So I'm shooting like kind of up a little bit. Yeah, it looks really good. I usually bounce between 28mm and 35mm for environmental portraiture, with 24 being just a bit wider than I'm used to. To avoid too much distortion, I tried to leave some negative space above Xenia in the frame in these shots. That's cool. Maybe do like literally walking, or if you just like fake a step.
I think I'll do this.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Is that alright?
Yeah. But old habits die hard, and in shots like these, I am breaking the rules a bit by getting this close with a 24mm. But here I like how Xenia is the obvious focal point of the image, but even when shooting this close, with a wide lens like this, you can still capture the setting behind, compared to say an 85mm lens, which would remove most of the background. My favourite way to use a 24mm prime is to get low and angle up. The distortion elongates limbs, and I like to ask models to pose wide and reach out towards the camera, for example, for a dramatic look. You can avoid some of that distortion affecting facial features by shooting landscape orientation like this and positioning the model in the center of the frame. Here's some shots using the R7, and we'll take a closer look later, but this lens works really well on the R7. You get closer to a 40mm focal length thanks to the crop factor. So rounding out this part of the shoot, so far I was pretty impressed with the lens just based on what I could see on the back of the camera. So let's take a closer look. So starting with a standard portrait, looking at rendering and sharpness, things look pretty good. Sharpness in the center is pretty impressive on the R5, and I would say it's probably as good as the RF 24-70. But let's see what that 1.8 aperture gets you compared to 2.8 at 24mm. Is it worth it over a 2.8 zoom? Here's 1.8 on the left and 2.8 on the right. It's hard to tell a difference really. The busy leaves in the background are a bit smoother at 1.8, but you have to zoom in pretty close to really notice a difference. If you're deciding between this lens and the 35mm 1.8, here's a quick comparison between the two different fields of view. Side by side, you capture more of the background with the 24mm of course, with the extra compression at 35mm appearing to bring the background closer to the model. But in terms of sharpness, they are very close, at least in the center anyway, and I think the new 24mm might be a bit sharper and more contrasty, wide open. And using the 24mm lens on the R7 gives you closer to a 38mm field of view after the 1.6 times crop. So you get more background compression, but less of the background blur you would get with the 35mm 1.8 on full frame, since that aperture becomes more like 2.8 on the R7, again thanks to the crop. Still, it's a useful lens on the R7, and in terms of sharpness, this performs much better than the RF 35mm on the R7 in terms of focus and sharpness. Still, not excellent, but much improved. I find 24mm is a really versatile focal length for video, so let's see how it looks on each camera, starting with the R5. Now here's the RF 35mm 1.8 on the R5 for the sake of comparing field of view again. And here's the 24mm on the R7, and this lens is an amazing option for video on this camera. I love the footage coming out of this combo. And now finally here's the C70. The focal length and optical stabilization makes this lens a favourite for me on the C70, as well as the crop giving you a more useful and versatile 35mm focal length equivalent. In general, I found this to be a great lens for video after using it throughout the day. It focused fast enough, but more importantly it focused smoothly when using face and eye detection AF. Walking and tracking shots worked great from the R5 to the C70. This lens also has macro functionality, and I haven't tested it too much, but it focuses well up close and retains plenty of sharpness, detail and contrast. Now, there is some bad news with this lens, and that is the pronounced barrel distortion and vignetting. Here you can see lens corrections off on the left and turned on the right. Now, it isn't the worst I've ever seen, but it is pretty bad. You're having to crop in a fair amount at the top and bottom of the image to correct the distortion, and there's lots of darkening at the edges. Here's another example, but this is with the RF 24-70 at 24mm, where the corrections are much less drastic, and I would typically expect to see less corrections in a prime than a zoom, even if it is a budget prime. One big advantage this lens has over the zoom, however, is in low light shooting. The faster 1.8 aperture is going to let in more light and let you keep that ISO lower. So in a shot like this, my ISO is a full stop lower than it would be if I was using the zoom, vastly reducing noise. Now, looking at handling, the lens is small and light, weighing in under 300 grams. It's made mostly from plastic and is not weather sealed. It has simple controls with the obvious focus ring and control ring. with an AF on-off switch and a switch to turn the stabilization on and off to. Now if you've ever owned or used the RF 35mm 1.8, you'll notice it more or less exactly shares its design with pretty much the same dimensions and size. It also has the same controls on the body and the same 49mm filter thread, despite the 24mm lens having a slightly bigger front element. I always liked the design of the 35mm 1.8 lens, so I'm a fan of the new RF 24mm design too. And sharing a lens housing like this is good for swapping out on gimbals or camera rigs. The lens feels great on the R5, you barely feel the weight of the lens on the front of the camera, making it a great lens for travel or something like street photography. And on the R7 it's much of the same. Even with the R7's slightly smaller grip, it feels at home on this camera and comfortable to use. It also handles very nicely on the C70 and makes for quite a nice, slimmed down, lightweight combination that's great for gimbal work. So that rounds out the video, and overall I was pretty impressed with the lens and enjoyed using it, even if it's not the first prime I would typically grab for a portrait shoot. I do think, however, it would make a pretty good combination alongside something like a 50mm prime. In that case, that would be a pretty versatile setup for portraits. I was mostly happy with the image quality from this lens. I thought the shots were sharp and contrasty wide open, despite the heavy lens corrections needed. For me, I'm just not too sure that 1.8 aperture at 24mm really makes a big difference in terms of things like separation compared to something like a 2.8 zoom at 24mm. I think it's probably just too wide, and maybe 1.4 would make more of a difference, but I'm not sure. And because of that, I'm not too sure if I'm going to keep it yet, but if I decide to, it will be probably because of its usefulness when it comes to video work. I think this lens is an amazing option for the C70 in particular, but it's great on the R7 and the R5 also as a lightweight vlogging setup or gimbal setup. So that brings this video to an end. Let me know down in the comments what you think of the lens and the images, and whether you would pick this lens up and your reasons why. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel and like the video. It really does help at this point. Thanks again, and I'll catch you in the next one.